Officer Frank Daniels was having a bad day. He rubbed his tired eyes as he drove his police car slowly through the streets of Pinewood. The small suburban town was usually quiet, but today had been different. First, there was the fight between the married couple on Oak Street, then the drunk man yelling at people outside the grocery store. And just an hour ago, he had chased a teenager who stole candy from the gas station. Frank was tired. His uniform felt tight around his neck, and his coffee had gone cold hours ago. The radio on his belt crackled. "Any units available for a report of vandalism at Pinewood Park? Caller says kids are spray painting the benches." Frank sighed and picked up his radio. Unit 27 responding. He turned his car toward the park, his mood getting worse by the minute. Pinewood Park was almost empty when Frank arrived. The evening, sun cast long shadows across the grass. Most parents had taken their children home for dinner. Frank stepped out of his car and looked around. He saw spray paint cans near some benches. The wooden seats were now covered with bright blue words and shapes. Then he noticed a boy about 12 years old moving strangely in the open field nearby. The kid was kicking and punching the air, making sharp, controlled movements. He was alone with no adults watching him. Frank walked toward the boy, his hand resting on his belt. "Hey, kid," he called out. "What are you doing here?" The boy stopped his movements and turned. He had sandy brown hair and freckles across his nose. He wasn't very big for his age, but something about the way he stood seemed confident, balanced. "Just practicing, sir," the boy said politely. Frank glanced at the spray-painted benches, then back at the boy. Practicing what? Making a mess of public property? The boy followed Frank's gaze to the benches and shook his head. "No, sir, I was practicing martial arts. I didn't do that." He pointed to the vandalized benches. Frank had heard too many lies today. The kid was alone in the park. Right next to the crime, it was obvious. "Sure you didn't," he said. "Empty your pockets." The boy seemed confused. "But I didn't do anything wrong." "Empty your pockets now," Frank repeated, his voice getting louder. His patience was wearing thin. The boy slowly reached into his pockets and pulled out a cell phone and a small wallet. No spray paint cans, no markers. Frank frowned. "Where did you hide the spray paint?" "I don't have any spray paint," the boy said. "I came here after school to practice. My name is Jake Morrison. You can call my mom if you want." Jake took a step toward his phone, which Frank had made him place on the ground. "Stay where you are," Frank ordered sharply. "I just want to call my mom," Jake explained, taking another step toward his phone. Frank saw the movement as defiance. All the frustration from his terrible day boiled over. "I said stop," he yelled. When Jake reached down for his phone, Frank pulled out his pepper spray and sprayed the boy directly in the face. Jake fell to his knees, screaming in pain. His hands covered his eyes as the burning chemicals did their work. He coughed and gasped, tears streaming down his red face. Frank suddenly realized what he had done. He had pepper sprayed a child who was just trying to reach for his phone. A cold feeling spread through his chest. "You shouldn't have moved," he said weakly, trying to justify his action. What Frank didn't know was that two teenagers were watching from behind a tree. They had recorded everything on their phones. They had also been the ones who spray-painted the benches earlier but ran when they heard the police car coming. "Did you see that?" One whispered to the other. "He just sprayed that kid for nothing. I'm posting this right now," the other replied, already typing on her phone. Frank called for medical help on his radio. "I need assistance at Pinewood Park. Minor affected by pepper spray." He didn't mention that he was the one who had sprayed the boy. As Jake continued to cry on the ground, a woman jogging in the park ran over. "What happened?" she asked, kneeling beside Jake. "Police business," Frank said firmly. "Please step back." The woman ignored him and helped Jake rinse his eyes with her water bottle. "I'm a nurse," she told Frank coldly, "and I saw what you did." Frank's radio buzzed again. His boss wanted to know exactly what happened at the park. By now, several more people had gathered around. Many had their phones out, recording. What none of them knew, especially not Officer Frank Daniels, was exactly who Jake Morrison was. They didn't know that his mother, Samantha Morrison, was the daughter of one of the most famous martial artists in the world. They didn't know that Jake had been training with his grandfather since he could walk. They didn't know that the boy's seemingly ordinary movements earlier were actually advanced techniques taught to him by none other than Chuck Norris himself. By the time the ambulance arrived to treat Jake's eyes, the video of the incident was already spreading online. It showed everything clearly. A police officer pepper spraying a polite boy who was just reaching for his phone. An hour later, Jake sat in the police station with cold towels on his face. His eyes were still red and swollen. A police officer had called his mother, who was on her way. Jake hadn't told them who his grandfather was. He didn't like to brag about it. Most kids at school didn't believe him anyway. Frank sat at his desk, writing his report. He claimed that Jake had made threatening movements. His fellow officers looked at him doubtfully. The chief of police, Bill Howard, was watching the video on his computer with a deep frown on his face. "Daniels," Chief Howard called out, "in my office now." Frank walked slowly to the chief's office, knowing he was in trouble. "What were you thinking?" Chief Howard asked, pointing at his computer screen. "This video has 50,000 views already." So. Boy was reaching for something, I thought. He was reaching for his phone to call his mother. The chief's face was turning red. "And now we have a PR nightmare." The phone on the chief's desk rang. He picked it up angrily. "Chief Howard speaking." As he listened to the caller, the color drained from his face. He looked through his office window at Jake sitting quietly in the waiting area. "Yes, ma'am. I understand. Yes, we will wait for you both to arrive." He hung up the phone slowly. "What is it?" Frank asked. Chief Howard looked like he had seen a ghost. That was Samantha Morrison, the boy's mother. He paused, taking a deep breath. "She's bringing her father with her." "So what?" Frank shrugged. "Her father," Chief Howard said, quietly as Chuck Norris. Frank's mouth fell open. The boy he had pepper sprayed was Chuck Norris's grandson. The video that was now going viral would soon include that information. Frank Daniels realized his career might be over. Outside the office, Jake looked up as the door opened. His eyes were still burning, but he managed a small smile. He knew his grandfather was coming and everything would be okay. Not because his grandfather was famous or tough, but because he was fair. His grandfather had always taught him that with great skill comes great responsibility. Jake watched Officer Daniels through the glass window. The man looked scared now. Jake almost felt sorry for him. After all, the officer had no way of knowing who Jake was. But soon, the whole world would know. The police station buzzed with nervous energy. Word had spread quickly among the officers that Chuck Norris was coming. Some younger cops were excited. Others, like Chief Howard, looked worried. No one wanted to face an angry Chuck Norris, especially when his grandson had been pepper sprayed for no good reason. Samantha Morrison rushed through the front doors of the station. She was a tall woman with light brown hair pulled back in a ponytail. Her face showed both worry and anger. "Where is my son?" she demanded at the front desk. The officer working there pointed toward Jake, who sat with cold towels on his face. Samantha hurried to him and gently removed the towels to look at his red, swollen eyes. "Jake, honey, are you okay?" she asked, touching his face carefully. "It still burns, Mom," Jake said, but it's better now." Samantha turned to the officers watching them. "Who did this to my son?" No one spoke. Frank Daniels had been moved to a back office, away from the front area. Chief Howard stepped forward, straightening his uniform. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm Chief Bill Howard. I want to assure you that we are taking this very seriously." Samantha stood up. "You should be. My father is on his way." The chief nodded nervously. "Yes, we received your call. We'll have a private room ready for your discussion." "It won't be private," Samantha said firmly. "The whole world will know about this. The video is already everywhere online." As if to prove her point, phones around the station buzzed with notifications. The news stations had picked up the story, and the headline was shocking. "Police officer pepper sprays Chuck Norris's grandson." Pictures of Chuck Norris and blurry screenshots from the video were appearing on every news site. Across town, at the Pinewood Martial Arts Center, Chuck Norris was teaching his advanced evening class. Though he was 76 years old, he moved with the grace and power of a much younger man. 20 students watched closely as he demonstrated a complex move. A young woman rushed into the room holding her phone. "Mr. Norris," she said urgently. "Your daughter just called the front desk. There's been an incident with Jake." Chuck stopped mid-movement. The room fell silent. He listened carefully as the woman explained what had happened. The students watched their teacher's face. They expected anger, maybe even rage. Instead, Chuck Norris became very still and calm. This was more frightening than any angry outburst. "Class dismissed," he said quietly. The students bowed respectfully as he walked out. Back at the police station, the situation was getting more tense. News vans had parked outside. Reporters held microphones and faced cameras, explaining that Chuck Norris's grandson had been pepper sprayed by local police. Inside, Chief Howard paced nervously in his office. The department's social media accounts were flooded with comments. Most were jokes about what Chuck Norris might do to the officer who hurt his grandson. "Officer doesn't know Chuck Norris doesn't call 911, 911 calls Chuck Norris," one person wrote. Another said, "That officer is going to need more than pepper spray when Chuck shows up." But some comments were serious, asking why a police officer would use pepper spray on a child. Frank Daniels sat in a small office staring at a wall. His career flashed before his eyes. He had been an officer for 8 years. He had a good record until today. One bad decision, one moment of lost temper, and now everything might be over. "I didn't know," he whispered to himself. "How could I have known?" There was a knock at the door. Another officer peeked in. "Daniels, he's here." Frank felt his heart jump. "Who?" "Chuck Norris. He just walked in." Frank stood up slowly. His legs felt weak. "What does he look like? Is he angry?" The officer shook his head. "That's the scary part. He looks totally calm." Chuck Norris entered the police station without making a scene. He wore a simple black jacket over a blue shirt and jeans. His face, famous from movies and television, showed no emotion. Officers and staff stopped what they were doing to watch him walk through the building. "Dad," Samantha said when she saw him. Chuck hugged his daughter, then knelt beside Jake. "How are you doing, tough guy?" he asked his grandson, examining his red eyes. "I'm okay, Grandpa," Jake said. "It doesn't hurt as much now." Chuck put his hand on Jake's shoulder. "You remember what I taught you about facing pain?" Jake nodded. "Pain is temporary. How we respond to it lasts forever." Chuck smiled slightly. "That's right." He stood and faced Chief Howard, who had come out of his office. "I'd like to see the officer involved," Chuck said. His voice was not loud, but it carried throughout the now quiet station. "Of course, Mr. Norris," the chief said quickly. "But first, would you like to see the body cam footage?" Officer Daniels was wearing his camera during the incident. "Yes," Chuck replied. "I would." In the chief's office, Chuck, Samantha, and Chief Howard watched the video from Frank's body camera. It showed everything. The vandalized benches, Jake practicing his martial arts, and the conversation that led to the pepper spray incident. Chuck watched without comment. When the video ended, he asked, "Where is Officer Daniels now?" "He's waiting. In another room," Chief Howard explained. "He's been placed on administrative leave pending our investigation." Chuck nodded. "I'd like to speak with him." Chief Howard looked surprised. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" "I'm sure," Chuck said firmly. Officer Frank Daniels felt like a man walking to his own execution as he entered the room. Chuck Norris sat at a table with Samantha and Chief Howard. Jake was not there. "Sit down, officer," Chuck said, pointing to an empty chair. Frank sat, unable to look Chuck in the eye. "Mr. Norris, I want to apologize." Chuck held up his hand. "Before you say anything else, I want you to know something. I'm not here to threaten you or demand you lose your job." Frank looked up, confused. "You're not?" "No," Chuck said. "I'm here because I want to understand what happened, and I want to make sure it doesn't happen to another child." Frank swallowed hard. This calm, reasonable approach was not what he expected. What no one in the room knew was that Lisa Kelly, an administrative assistant, had left her phone on a shelf, recording the entire conversation. She had planned to sell the video to a news station, thinking she would capture Chuck Norris threatening the officer. Instead, she was recording something very different. "Tell me, Officer Daniels," Chuck continued, "why did you feel you needed to use pepper spray on my grandson?" Frank tried to find the right words. "I had a really bad day. I made a mistake. I thought he was reaching for a weapon, but he was just trying to get his phone." Even as he said it, Frank knew how weak it sounded. Chuck leaned forward. "A mistake can change lives forever, Officer Daniels. You're lucky my grandson only suffered temporary pain." "I know," Frank said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. What happened next would change everything." Instead of demanding punishment, Chuck Norris made an unexpected suggestion. "I believe in second chances," he said. "But I also believe in accountability. Here's what I propose. Instead of just suspending you, why not turn this into a learning opportunity? I offer training programs on discipline and control. Perhaps you could benefit from that training." Chief Howard looked surprised. "You want to train Officer Daniels?" "Not just him," Chuck said. "I think your whole department could learn something, and in return, maybe your officers could teach some safety classes at my martial arts center." As they discussed the details, Lisa's phone continued to record. Later that night, when she checked her phone, she found that it had automatically started live streaming to her social media account. Over 2 million people had watched Chuck Norris turn a potential disaster into an opportunity for positive change. Outside the police station, reporters waited for the explosive confrontation they expected. Instead, they watched as Chuck and Jake left the building peacefully. Jake's eyes were still red, but he walked tall beside his grandfather. "Mr. Norris," a reporter called out. "What happened in there? Are you pressing charges against the officer?" Chuck stopped and looked at the cameras. "Today could have been about anger and revenge," he said. "Instead, we chose to make it about learning and improvement. That's the real strength." As they drove away, neither Chuck nor Jake noticed how many phones were pointed at them, recording his words. They didn't know that by morning a news story would spread across the world. Not about a police officer who made a mistake, but about a legend who chose wisdom over vengeance. And Frank Daniels, watching them leave from a window, had no idea that his worst day was about to become the start of his greatest change. The morning after the incident, Frank Daniels woke up to his phone ringing nonstop. Friends, family, and even reporters were calling him. Frank ignored them all. He felt sick about what had happened. The image of Jake Morrison falling to the ground in pain kept playing in his mind. Frank turned on the TV, expecting to see himself being attacked by the news. Instead, he was shocked to see Chuck Norris on the screen, calmly talking to a reporter. "Violence is never the answer to violence," Chuck was saying. "Officer Daniels made a mistake. Now he has a chance to learn from it." Frank sat down heavily on his couch. He had expected Chuck Norris to demand he be fired, maybe even try to sue the department. Instead, Chuck was talking about learning and second chances. The news showed clips from the live stream that had gone viral overnight. In the video, Chuck suggested a training program for the police department. The reporter explained that the video had already been watched by over 5 million people. Frank's phone rang again. This time it was Chief Howard. "Daniels, have you seen the news?" the chief asked. "Yes, sir," Frank replied. "I just turned it on. We're getting calls from police departments across the country," Chief Howard said. "They all want to know more about this training program Chuck Norris mentioned." Frank was confused. "But it doesn't even exist yet." "It will soon," the chief said. "Mr. Norris has asked to meet with us today at his martial arts center. Be there at noon." After hanging up, Frank sat in silence. He had expected to lose his. Now he was going to meet with Chuck Norris again, this time at his martial arts center. Frank felt nervous but also curious. Across town, Jake Morrison was eating breakfast with his mother and grandfather. His eyes were still a bit red, but the swelling had gone down. "Do you really think this will work, Dad?" Samantha asked Chuck. It's worth trying, Chuck replied. That officer needed better training, not punishment. Jake looked up from his cereal. But he hurt me, Grandpa. Chuck nodded. Yes, he did. And that was wrong. But now we have a chance to make sure he doesn't hurt anyone else. Sometimes the best way to fix a problem is to teach people to be better. Jake thought about this. His grandfather had always taught him that martial arts was about discipline and control, not about hurting others. Will I have to see him again, Jake asked. Only if you want to, Chuck assured him. But I think it might be good for both of you. At noon, Frank arrived at the Pinewood Martial Arts Center. The building was plain from the outside, but inside it was impressive. The walls were lined with photos of Chuck Norris with famous people. There were trophies and awards in glass cases. Frank expected to see just Chief Howard and Chuck Norris. Instead, there were 10 other police officers from his department already there. They sat in a circle on the training mat. Chuck stood in the center, wearing a black martial arts uniform. Welcome, Officer Daniels, Chuck said. Please join us. Frank nervously took off his shoes and stepped onto the mat. He sat in the open spot in the circle. I've been talking with your fellow officers, Chuck explained. We've been discussing what happened yesterday and how we can learn from it. Frank looked around at his colleagues. Some avoided his eyes, but others gave him encouraging nods. First, Chuck continued, I want to introduce you to someone. A side door opened and Jake walked in with his mother. Frank felt his face get hot with shame. He hadn't expected to see the boy so soon. Jake has agreed to talk about what happened from his perspective, Chuck said. Jake stood next to his grandfather. He looked nervous but determined. When you sprayed. Me, Jake said to Frank. I was scared. I didn't understand what I did wrong. I was just trying to call my mom. Frank nodded, tears forming in his eyes. I'm so sorry, Jake. I made a terrible mistake. I accept your apology, Jake said simply. My grandpa says everyone deserves a second chance. The room was quiet. Frank was surprised by the boy's maturity. Chuck placed his hand on Jake's shoulder. Thank you, Jake. You can go now if you want. But Jake shook his head. I want to stay and watch. For the next hour, Chuck talked to the officers about the importance of staying calm under pressure. He explained how martial artists train their minds to remain clear even in difficult situations. Being a police officer is like being a martial artist, Chuck told them. You have power that others don't have. How you use that power matters. Then Chuck asked the officers to stand. He showed them simple breathing techniques to help them stay calm. He demonstrated ways to stand and move that allowed better control in tense situations. Frank tried his best to focus, but he still felt ashamed about what he had done. During a break, he approached Jake, who was watching from the side. I want you to know how sorry I am, Frank said quietly. Jake looked at him. Grandpa says actions speak louder than words, so show me you're sorry by learning what he's teaching. The wisdom in the boy's words surprised Frank. He nodded and returned to the group with new determination. What no one in the room knew was that Lisa Kelly, the administrative assistant who had live-streamed the meeting at the police station, was at it again. She had snuck into the martial arts center and was recording everything from a small office nearby. She wasn't doing it to cause trouble this time. She genuinely believed people needed to see what was happening. As the training continued, Chuck paired the officers up for practice. When it was Frank's turn, Chuck surprised everyone by partnering with him personally. The key to control, Chuck explained as they stood face to face, is knowing when to act and when to wait. The other officers watched as Chuck guided Frank through a series of movements designed to help manage confrontations without violence. In martial arts, Chuck told the group, we learned that true strength is not about overpowering others, but about having such good control that force isn't needed. By the end of the session, Frank felt different. His shame was still there, but alongside it was something new, a sense of purpose. Before everyone left, Chuck made an announcement. This is just the beginning, he said. I'm proposing a 6-week training program for your department. Chief Howard has already agreed to it. The officers looked surprised, but most seemed interested. And, Chuck continued, we'll be inviting other departments to observe. If this works, we could change how police officers are trained across the country. As the officers filed out, talking excitedly among themselves, Frank stayed behind. He watched as Chuck spoke quietly with Jake and Samantha. Chuck noticed Frank waiting and walked over to him. "You did well today," he said. "Thank you, sir," Frank replied. "But I don't understand why you're doing this. I hurt your grandson. You could have demanded I be fired." Chuck looked at him thoughtfully. 20 years ago, maybe I would have. But I've learned that changing one person can change many lives. You made a mistake, yes, but now you have a chance to help fix a bigger problem. Frank nodded slowly, beginning to understand. "Besides," Chuck added with a slight smile, "Jake thinks you have potential." Later that night, videos from the training session began to spread online. People who had expected to see Chuck Norris humiliate or threaten the officer were surprised by what they saw instead. Comments flooded in, with many people expressing admiration for Chuck's approach. One comment in particular stood out. "This is how real change happens, not through more violence, but through teaching better ways." As Frank sat at home watching the videos spread, he realized that his worst mistake had somehow opened the door to something important. He still had a long way to go to earn back trust, but for the first time since the incident, he felt hopeful. And across town, Jake Morrison proudly showed his friends at school the new moves his grandfather had taught him, moves that were about control, not aggression. The other kids listened with new respect, knowing now that Jake's stories about his grandfather had been true all along. What none of them could know was that this was just the beginning of a much bigger change, one that would eventually reach far beyond their small town of Pinewood. 3 months passed. The Pinewood Police Department had changed in ways no one could have predicted. Chuck Norris's training program, now officially called the Control Method, had become a regular part of the officers' schedule. Twice a week, they trained at the Martial Arts Center, learning techniques that helped them handle difficult situations without using force. Frank Daniels had become the most dedicated student. He arrived early for each session and stayed late to practice. The shame of pepper spraying Jake had turned into a strong desire to improve. Frank wanted to be a better officer, a better person. Chuck noticed Frank's efforts. After one training session, he asked Frank to stay behind. "You're making good progress," Chuck said as they sat on a bench in the empty training room. "Thank you, sir," Frank replied. "I'm trying my best." Chuck nodded. "I can see that, but I think you're still carrying too much guilt. You need to forgive yourself." Frank looked down at his hands. "How can I? Every time I see Jake, I remember what I did to him." "That's why I asked you to stay today," Chuck said. "Jake has a suggestion." The door opened and Jake walked in. At 12 years old, he wasn't very tall, but he carried himself with confidence. 3 months of extra training with his grandfather had made him even better at martial arts. "Hi, Officer Daniels," Jake said. "Hi, Jake," Frank replied, surprised to see him. Jake looked at his grandfather, who nodded encouragingly. "I want you to help me teach a safety class for kids at my school," Jake said to Frank, "to show them how to stay safe and what to do if they're in trouble." Frank was stunned. "You want me to teach kids, after what I did?" Jake shrugged. "That's the point. You made a mistake, but now you know better. You can help other kids so the same thing doesn't happen to them." Frank looked at Chuck, who smiled slightly. "It was his idea," Chuck explained. "Not mine." Frank thought about it. Teaching kids about safety could be a way to make up for his mistake. It scared him, but it also felt right. "Okay," he said finally. "I'll do it." Jake grinned. "Great, we start next week." As Jake left, Frank turned to Chuck. "He's a remarkable kid." "Yes, he is," Chuck agreed. "And he's teaching us as much as we're teaching him." The next week, Frank found himself standing in front of 35th graders at Pinewood Elementary School. He wore his police uniform, but without his pepper spray or gun. Jake stood beside him, wearing a t-shirt that said Junior Safety Instructor. "This is Officer Daniels," Jake told his classmates. "He's going to teach us about safety and what to do if you need to talk to a police officer." Frank was nervous, but as he began talking to the kids, he found that it came naturally. He explained that police officers were there to help, but that sometimes they made mistakes when they felt scared or angry. Just like you might say something mean when you're angry, sometimes grown-ups make bad choices too, he told them. But the important thing is to learn from mistakes. The kids asked questions and Frank answered honestly. When one boy asked why police officers sometimes hurt people, Frank didn't make excuses. Sometimes it's because they're afraid, he explained. Sometimes it's because they haven't learned better ways to handle tough situations. That's why I'm learning new ways to do my job better. After the class, the school principal asked if Frank and Jake could make their safety lessons a regular event. They agreed, and soon they were visiting other schools too. What surprised Frank the most was how Jake treated him. The boy never mentioned the pepper spray incident directly. Instead, he treated Frank like a partner, someone he respected. It helped Frank begin to forgive himself. Meanwhile, the videos of the training sessions had gained millions of views online. Police departments from other cities began calling Chief Howard, asking if their officers could observe the training. Lisa Kelly, the administrative assistant who had recorded the first meetings, had become the unofficial videographer for the program. With Chuck's permission, she created a website called The Control Method, where she posted videos of the training sessions and interviews with the officers about what they were learning. The website caught the attention of Dr. Maria Rodriguez, a scientist who studied human behavior at the State University. She was fascinated by how quickly the Pinewood officers had adopted new ways of handling conflicts. Dr. Rodriguez came to observe one of the training sessions. She watched as Chuck demonstrated a technique for remaining calm when someone was yelling, "At you." The officers practiced controlling their breathing and keeping their voices steady. What really caught Dr. Rodriguez's attention, though, was Jake. She noticed that the boy seemed to have unusually quick reflexes. During a demonstration, Chuck pretended to reach for an officer suddenly, and the officer flinched. But when he did the same to Jake, the boy moved smoothly out of the way before Chuck's hand even got close. After the session, Dr. Rodriguez approached. "Chuck, your grandson has remarkable reflexes," she said. "Has he always been that way?" Chuck smiled. "He's a natural. Some things can't be taught. They have to be in your blood." Dr. Rodriguez was intrigued. She asked if she could run some tests on Jake's reaction time as part of a study she was doing. Samantha was hesitant at first, but Jake was excited about the idea of being part of a scientific study. "It won't hurt," Dr. Rodriguez assured them. "Just some simple exercises to measure how quickly he responds to visual and audio cues." They agreed, and the following week, Jake went to Dr. Rodriguez's lab at the university. The tests were simple. Games like pressing a button when a light flashed or responding to different sounds. When Dr. Rodriguez analyzed the results, she was amazed. Jake's reaction times were far beyond the normal range for his age, or any age for that matter. In some tests, he seemed to respond even before the stimulus occurred, as if he could anticipate what was coming. Dr. Rodriguez called Chuck and Samantha to discuss her findings. "Jake's abilities are extraordinary," she told them. "His nervous system seems to process information faster than what we typically see in humans." "Is that bad?" Samantha asked, concerned. "Not at all," Dr. Rodriguez replied. "It's just unusual. I'd like to do more tests if you're willing. I believe Jake might have a rare genetic trait that enhances neural processing." Chuck wasn't surprised. He had noticed Jake's unusual abilities from an early age. It was one reason he had started training the boy so young. "Have you ever had your own reflexes tested, Mr. Norris?" Dr. Rodriguez asked. Chuck shook his head. "No need. I've always known I was a bit different." Dr. Rodriguez smiled. "I think we might be seeing a genetic trait passed down through your family line. It could explain some of your own remarkable abilities throughout your career." As they discussed the possibilities, Frank Daniels was across town, talking to a group of officers from a neighboring city who had come to learn about the control method. Frank shared his story openly, explaining how his mistake had led to an unexpected opportunity for change. "The most important thing I've learned," he told them, "is that power without control is dangerous, but control without compassion is just as bad." The visiting officers were impressed by Frank's honesty and the changes they saw in the Pinewood Police Department. They asked many questions about the training and how it could be implemented in their own departments. That evening, when Frank checked the Control Method website, he was surprised to see a new video. It showed him teaching the safety class with Jake explaining to the children how to stay calm in scary situations. The comments below the video were overwhelmingly positive. One comment stood out. "This is what real strength looks like, admitting mistakes and working to be better. Both. The officer and the kid are heroes in my book." Frank read the words several times. For the first time since the pepper spray incident, he felt like maybe, just maybe, something good had come from his terrible mistake. What he didn't know was that Dr. Rodriguez's discovery about Jake's abilities would soon open up an entirely new chapter in their story. One that would change not just their lives, but potentially the future of humanity. 5 years had passed since the day Officer Frank Daniels pepper-sprayed a boy without knowing he was Chuck Norris's grandson. That mistake, which could have ended his career, instead started something remarkable. Frank sat in his new office at the Pinewood Police Department. The sign on his door read, "Sergeant Frank Daniels, Community Relations." His walls were covered with photos of safety classes and training sessions. In the center was a framed newspaper article with the headline, "Local Police Program Becomes National Model." Frank smiled as he looked at a recent photo of himself with Jake Morrison, now 17 years old. They stood side by side at a training center opening in a neighboring state. Over the past 5 years, they had become an unlikely team, traveling to police departments across the country to talk about the control method. A knock on his door interrupted Frank's thoughts. Chief Howard entered holding a tablet. "Have you seen the latest numbers?" the chief asked, showing Frank the screen. Frank looked at the report. Since implementing the control method 5 years ago, use of force incidents in their department had dropped by 87%. Complaints against officers were down by 92%. Similar results were appearing in departments that had adopted the program. "Chuck would be pleased," Frank said. Chief Howard nodded. "He always said this would work if we gave it a real chance." Although Chuck still occasionally taught at his martial arts center, he had largely passed the training program leadership to Frank and Jake. At 81, Chuck wanted to spend more time with his family, though he still moved with the strength and balance of a much younger man. Across town at Pinewood High School, Jake Morrison was finishing his senior year. He was not like other teenagers. His unusual abilities, first noticed by Dr. Rodriguez 5 years ago, had only grown stronger. Jake could react to things before they happened, sensing movements and changes that others couldn't detect. Dr. Rodriguez had spent years studying Jake and other members of Chuck Norris's family. She discovered that they carried a rare genetic trait that enhanced neural processing and physical reactions. She called it the Norris effect, though Chuck always laughed at the name. Jake had learned to hide his abilities at school. He deliberately slowed his movements in sports, though he was still the star of the martial arts team. Only a few people knew the truth about what he could do. That afternoon, Jake met with Dr. Rodriguez at her university lab. Now a leading researcher in human potential, she had expanded her work to identify others with similar genetic traits. "We've found 28 more people with variations of the same genetic markers," she told Jake, as they reviewed data on her computer. "Most are distant relatives of your grandfather, though they don't know it." Jake nodded. "What does this mean for the training program?" Dr. Rodriguez smiled. "It means your grandfather's methods work especially well for people with these genetic traits, but they also help everyone improve their control and reactions, even without the special genetics." This was good news for the control method training programs which had spread to police departments in 48 states. The training didn't just teach physical techniques. It taught mental discipline, emotional control, and better decision-making under pressure. Later that day, Jake walked into the Pinewood Martial Arts Center for a special ceremony. The center had expanded over the years with new training rooms and a research area where Dr. Rodriguez worked with volunteers. The main room was filled with people. Police officers from across the country stood alongside martial arts students and community members. Jake's mother, Samantha, was there, along with Frank Daniels and Chief Howard. And at the center of it all was Chuck Norris, still commanding respect with his presence alone. "Welcome, everyone," Chuck said. The room fell silent. Today marks 5 years since we started the Control Method program. What began as a response to an unfortunate incident has grown into something none of us expected. Jake took his place beside his grandfather. They looked similar now, with the same steady gaze and balanced stance. "I'm proud to announce that the National Police Training Academy has officially adopted our methods as part of their standard curriculum," Chuck continued. "Starting next month, every new police officer in the country will learn these techniques." The room erupted in applause. Frank caught Jake's eye across the room and smiled. They had come so far from that day in the park. Chuck held up his hand for quiet. "But that's not the only announcement I have today. Dr. Rodriguez has something to share." Dr. Rodriguez stepped forward with a tablet in her hand. "Our research into the genetic factors behind enhanced human capabilities has led to an important discovery. The training methods developed here don't just improve control, they actually enhance neural pathways in the brain." She showed a series of brain scans on a large screen. These show the brain of an officer before training and after 6 months of the control method. The changes are significant, suggesting that these techniques can help all humans reach more of their potential. As Dr. Rodriguez explained the science, Jake thought about how strange it was that all of this had started with him being pepper sprayed in a park. One bad moment had led to years of positive change. After the ceremony, people gathered in small groups to talk. Jake found himself standing with Frank, who was now one of his closest friends despite their rough beginning. "Did you ever imagine we'd end up here?" Jake asked. Frank shook his head. "Never. I thought my life was over that day." In the park. "Things work out in strange ways," Jake said. Frank nodded. "Your grandfather told me something once that I've never forgotten. He said that the true measure of a person isn't how they handle success, but how they respond to mistakes." A young police cadet approached them, looking nervous. "Sergeant Daniels? Mr. Morrison? I just wanted to say that your story inspired me to become an officer. I want to be part of this change." As Frank talked with the cadet, Jake noticed his grandfather watching from across the room. Chuck gave him a small nod of approval. Later, as they were cleaning up after the ceremony, Chuck and Jake had a moment alone. "I'm proud of you," Chuck told his grandson. "You turned a painful experience into something good." "I learned that from you," Jake replied. Chuck smiled. "The world is changing, Jake. People like you, with your abilities, will help guide that change. But remember, the greatest power isn't in your quick reflexes or special genetics. It's in how I choose to use them," Jake finished. Chuck nodded. "Exactly." As they walked out of the center together, the setting sun cast long shadows. Chuck Norris and his grandson, 2 generations with extraordinary abilities, stepped into a future they were helping to shape. Behind them came Frank Daniels, once their unlikely adversary, now a partner in their mission. None of them knew exactly what the future would bring, but they had learned that even the worst moments could lead to unexpected transformations. What you had started with a mistake in a park had become a movement that was changing how humans understood their own potential. The next day, the local newspaper ran a story about the ceremony. The headline read, "From Pepper Spray to Paradigm Shift, How One Mistake Launched Humanity Forward." Frank Daniels cut out the article and pinned it to his office wall. It was a reminder that sometimes the worst days can lead to the best changes, and that true strength comes not from power over others, but from the wisdom to use power wisely. As Jake prepared to graduate and take a larger role in the training program, he often thought about the strange path that had brought him here. One moment of pain had led to years of growth and discovery. It wasn't the story he would have chosen, but it was a story that had changed countless lives for the better, and in the end, that made it a story worth telling.